Chapter 11 of Anna Karenina, Book 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Cole. Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Constance Garnett, Book 3, Chapter 11. In the middle of July, the elder of the village on Levin's sister's estate, about 15 miles from Pokrovskoe, came to Levin to report on how things were going there and on the hay. The chief source of income on his sister's estate was from the riverside meadows. In former years the hay had been bought by the peasants for 20 roubles the 3 acres. When Levin took over the management of the estate, he thought on examining the grasslands that they were worth more, and he fixed the price at 25 roubles the 3 acres. The peasants would not give that price, and, as Levin suspected, kept off other purchasers. Then Levin had driven over himself and arranged to have the grass cut, partly by hired labour, partly at a payment of a certain proportion of the crop. His own peasants put every hindrance they could in the way of this new arrangement, but it was carried out, and the first year the meadows had yielded a profit almost double. The previous year, which was the third year, the peasants had maintained the same opposition to the arrangement, and the hay had been cut on the same system. This year the peasants were doing all the mowing for a third of the hay crop, and the village elder had come now to announce that the hay had been cut, and that, fearing rain, they had invited the counting-house clerk over, had divided the crop in his presence, and had raked together 11 stacks as the owner's share. From the vague answers to his question how much hay had been cut on the principal meadow, from the hurry of the village elder who had made the division, not asking leave, from the whole tone of the peasant, Levin perceived that there was something wrong in the division of the hay, and made up his mind to drive over himself to look into the matter. Arriving for dinner at the village, and leaving his horse at the cottage of an old friend of his, the husband of his brother's wet nurse, Levin went to see the old man in his bee-house, wanting to find out from him the truth about the hay. Parmenitch, a talkative, comely old man, gave Levin a very warm welcome, showing him all he was doing, told him everything about his bees and the swarms of that year, but gave vague and unwilling answers to Levin's inquiries about the mowing. This confirmed Levin still more in his suspicions. He went to the hayfields and examined the stacks. The haystacks could not possibly contain 50 wagon loads each, and to convict the peasants, Levin ordered the wagons that had carried the hay to be brought up directly, to lift one stack and carry it into the barn. There turned out to be only 32 loads in the stack. In spite of the village elder's assertions about the compressibility of hay, and its having settled down in the stacks, and his swearing that everything had been done in the fear of God, Levin stuck to his point that the hay had been divided without his orders, and that therefore he would not accept that hay as 50 loads to a stack. After a prolonged dispute the matter was decided by the peasants taking these 11 stacks, reckoning them as 50 loads each. The arguments and the division of the haycocks lasted the whole afternoon. When the last of the hay had been divided, Levin, entrusting the superintendence of the rest to the counting-house clerk, sat down on a haycock marked off by a stake of willow, and looked admiringly at the meadow swarming with peasants. In front of him, in the bend of the river beyond the marsh, moved a bright-coloured line of peasant women, and the scattered hay was being rapidly formed into grey winding rows over the pale green stubble. After the women came the men with pitchforks, and from the grey rows there were growing up broad, high, soft haycocks. To the left, carts were rumbling over the meadow that had been already cleared, and one after another the haycocks vanished, flung up in huge forkfuls, and in their place there were rising heavy cartloads of fragrant hay, hanging over the horses' hind quarters. "What weather for haying! What hay it'll be!" said an old man, squatting down beside Levin. "It's tea, not hay. It's like scattering grain to the ducks, the way they pick it up," he added, pointing to the growing haycocks. "Since dinner time they've carried a good half of it. The last load, eh?" he shouted to a young peasant who drove by, standing in the front of an empty cart, shaking the cord reins. "The last, Dad," the lad shouted back, pulling in the horse and smiling. He looked round at a bright, rosy-cheeked peasant girl who sat in the cart smiling too, and drove on. "Who's that? Your son?" asked Levin. "My baby," said the old man with a tender smile. "What a fine fellow!" "The lad's all right." "Married already?" "Yes, it's 2 years last St. Philip's Day." "Any children?" "Children indeed." "Why, for over a year he was innocent as a babe himself, and bashful too," answered the old man. "Well, the hay, it's as fragrant as tea," he repeated, wishing to change the subject. Levin looked more attentively at Ivan Parmenov and his wife. They were loading a haycock onto the cart not far from him. Ivan Parmenov was standing on the cart, taking, laying in place, and stamping down the huge bundles of hay, which his pretty young wife deftly handled up to him, at first in armfuls and then on the pitchfork. The young wife worked easily, merrily, and dexterously. The close-packed hay did not once break away off her fork. First she gathered it together, stuck the fork in it, then with a rapid, supple movement leaned the whole weight of her body on it, and at once, with a bend of her back under the red belt, she drew herself up, and, arching her full bosom under the white smock, with a smart turn, swung the fork in her arms, and flung the bundle of hay high onto the cart. Ivan, obviously doing his best to save her every minute of unnecessary labour, made haste, opening his arms to clutch the bundle and lay it in the cart. As she raked together what was left of the hay, the young wife shook off the bits of hay that had fallen on her neck, and straightening the red kerchief that had dropped forward over her white brow, not browned like her face by the sun, she crept under the cart to tie up the load. Ivan directed her how to fasten the cord to the crosspiece, and at something she said he laughed aloud. In the expressions of both faces was to be seen vigorous, young, freshly awakened love. End of chapter 11. Read by David Cole, Medway, Massachusetts. Chapter 12 of Anna Karenina, Book 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Cole. Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Constance Garnett. Book 3, Chapter 12. The load was tied on. Ivan jumped down and took the quiet, sleek horse by the bridle. The young wife flung the rake up on the load, and with a bold step, swinging her arms, she went to join the women, who were forming a ring for the haymakers' dance. Ivan drove off to the road and fell into line with the other loaded carts. The peasant women, with their rakes on their shoulders, gay with bright flowers, and chattering with ringing, merry tones, walked behind the hay-cart. One wild, untrained female voice broke into a song, and sang it alone through a verse, and then the same verse was taken up and repeated by 100 strong, healthy voices, of all sorts, coarse and fine, singing in unison. The women, all singing, began to come close to Levin, and he felt as though a storm was swooping down upon him with the thunder of merriment. The storm swooped down, enveloped him, and the haycock on which he was lying, and the other haycock, and the wagon loads, and the whole meadow and distant fields, All seemed to be shaking and singing to the measures of this wild merry song, with its shouts and whistles and clapping. Levin felt envious of this health and mirthfulness. He longed to take part in the expression of this joy of life, but he could do nothing, and had to lie and look on and listen. When the peasants with their singing had vanished out of sight and hearing, a weary feeling of despondency at his own isolation, his physical inactivity, his alienation from this world, came over Levin. Some of the very peasants who had been most active in wrangling with him over the hay, some whom he had treated with contumely, and who had tried to cheat him, those very peasants had greeted him good-humouredly, and evidently had not, were incapable of having any feeling of rancour against him, any regret, any recollection even of having tried to deceive him. All that was drowned in a sea of merry common labour. God gave the day, God gave the strength, and the day and the strength were consecrated to labour, and that labour was its own reward. For whom the labour? What would be its fruits? These were idle considerations, beside the point. Often Levin had admired this life, often he had a sense of envy of the men who led this life. But today, for the first time, especially under the influence of what he had seen in the attitude of Ivan Parmenov to his young wife, the idea presented itself definitely to his mind that it was in his power to exchange the dreary, artificial, idle, individualistic life he was leading for this laborious, pure, and socially delightful life. The old man who had been sitting beside him had long ago gone home. The people had all separated. Those who lived near had gone home, while those who came from far were gathered into a group for supper, and to spend the night in the meadow. Levin, unobserved by the peasants, lay still on the haycock, and still looked on and listened and mused. The peasants who remained for the night in the meadow scarcely slept all the short summer night. At first there was the sound of merry talk and laughing all together over the supper, then singing again and laughter. All the long day of toil had left no trace in them but lightness of heart. Before the early dawn all was hushed. Nothing was to be heard but the night sounds of the frogs that never ceased in the marsh, and the horses snorting in the mist that rose over the meadow before the morning. Rousing himself, Levin got up from the haycock, and looking at the stars he saw that the night was over. "Well, what am I going to do? How am I to set about it?" he said to himself, trying to express to himself all the thoughts and feelings he had passed through in that brief night. All the thoughts and feelings he had passed through fell into three separate trains of thought. One was the renunciation of his old life, of his utterly useless education. This renunciation gave him satisfaction and was easy and simple. Another series of thoughts and mental images related to the life he longed to live now. The simplicity, the purity, the sanity of this life he felt clearly, and he was convinced that he would find in it the content, the peace and the dignity, of the lack of which he was so miserably conscious. But a third series of ideas turned upon the question how to effect this transition from the old life to the new, and there nothing took clear shape for him. Have a wife, have work and the necessity of work, leave Pokrovskoe, buy land, become a member of a peasant community, marry a peasant girl. How am I to set about it, he asked himself again, and could not find an answer. I haven't slept all night though, and I can't think it out clearly, he said to himself. I'll work it out later. One thing's certain, this night has decided my fate. All my old dreams of home life were absurd, not the real thing, he told himself. It's all ever so much simpler and better. How beautiful, he thought, looking at the strange, as it were, mother of pearl shell of white fleecy cloudlets resting right over his head in the middle of the sky. How exquisite it all is in this exquisite night! And when was there time for that cloud shell to form? Just now I looked at the sky and there was nothing in it. Only two white streaks. Yes, and so imperceptibly too, my views of life changed. He went out to the meadow and walked along the high road towards the village. A slight wind arose and the sky looked grey and sullen. The gloomy moment had come that usually precedes the dawn, the full triumph of light over darkness. Shrinking from the cold, Levin walked rapidly, looking at the ground. What's that? Some one coming, he thought, catching the tinkle of bells and lifting his head. 40 paces from him, a carriage with 4 horses harnessed abreast was driving towards him along the grassy road on which he was walking. The shaft horses were tilted against the shafts by the ruts, but the dexterous driver sitting on the box held the shaft over the ruts, so that the wheels ran on the smooth part of the road. This was all Levin noticed, and without wondering who it could be, he gazed absently at the coach. In the coach was an old lady dozing in one corner, and at the window, evidently only just awake, sat a young girl holding in both hands the ribbons of a white cap. With a face full of light and thought, full of a subtle, complex inner life that was remote from Levin, she was gazing beyond him at the glow of the sunrise. At the very instant when this apparition was vanishing, the truthful eyes glanced at him. She recognized him, and her face lighted up with wondering delight. He could not be mistaken. There were no other eyes like those in the world. There was only one creature in the world that could concentrate for him all the brightness and meaning of life. It was she. It was Kitty. He understood that she was driving to Ergushova from the railway station, and everything that had been stirring Levin during that sleepless night, all the resolutions he had made, all vanished at once. He recalled with horror his dreams of marrying a peasant girl. There only, in the carriage that had crossed over to the other side of the road and was rapidly disappearing, there only could he find the solution of the riddle of his life, which had weighed so agonizingly upon him of late. She did not look out again. The sound of the carriage springs was no longer audible. The bells could scarcely be heard. The barking of dogs showed the carriage had reached the village, and all that was left was the empty fields all round, the village in front, and he himself, isolated and apart from it all, wandering lonely along the deserted highroad. He glanced at the sky, expecting to find there the cloud shell he had been admiring, and taking as the symbol of the ideas and feeling of that night. There was nothing in the sky in the least like a shell. There, in the remote heights above, a mysterious change had been accomplished. There was no trace of shell, and there was stretched over fully half the sky an even cover of tiny and ever tinier cloudlets. The sky had grown blue and bright, and with the same softness, but with the same remoteness, it met his questioning gaze. No, he said to himself, however good that life of simplicity and toil may be, I cannot go back to it. I love her. End of chapter 12, read by David Cole, Medway, Massachusetts.
Chapter 13 of Anna Karenina, Book 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philip Griffiths. Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Constance Garnett. Book 3, Chapter 13. None but those who were most intimate with Alexey Alexandrovitch knew that while on the surface the coldest and most reasonable of men, he had one weakness quite opposed to the general trend of his character. Alexey Alexandrovitch could not hear or see a child or woman crying without being moved. The sight of tears threw him into a state of nervous agitation, and he utterly lost all power of reflection. The chief secretary of his department and his private secretary were aware of this, and used to warn women who came with petitions on no account to give way to tears, if they did not want to ruin their chances. "He will get angry and will not listen to you," they used to say. And as a fact, in such cases the emotional disturbance set up in Alexey Alexandrovitch by the sight of tears found expression in hasty anger. "I can do nothing. Kindly leave the room," he would commonly cry in such cases. When returning from the races, Anna had informed him of her relations with Vronsky, and immediately afterwards had burst into tears, hiding her face in her hands. Alexey Alexandrovitch, for all the fury aroused in him against her, was aware at the same time of a rush of that emotional disturbance always produced in him by tears. Conscious of it, and conscious that any expression of his feelings at that minute would be out of keeping with the position, he tried to suppress every manifestation of life in himself, and so neither stirred nor looked at her. This was what had caused the strange expression of death-like rigidity in his face which had so impressed Anna. When they reached the house, he helped her to get out of the carriage, and making an effort to master himself, took leave of her with his usual urbanity, and uttered that phrase that bound him to nothing. He said that tomorrow he would let her know his decision. His wife's words, confirming his worst suspicions, had sent a cruel pang to the heart of Alexey Alexandrovitch. That pang was intensified by the strange feeling of physical pity for her set up by her tears. But when he was all alone in the carriage, Alexey Alexandrovitch, to his surprise and delight, felt complete relief both from this pity and from the doubts and agonies of jealousy. He experienced the sensations of a man who has had a tooth out after suffering long from toothache. After a fearful agony and a sense of something huge, bigger than the head itself, being torn out of his jaw, the sufferer, hardly able to believe in his own good luck, feels all at once that what has so long poisoned his existence and enchained his attention exists no longer, and that he can live and think again and take interest in other things besides his tooth. This feeling Alexey Alexandrovitch was experiencing. The agony had been strange and terrible, but now it was over. He felt that he could live again and think of something other than his wife. No honor, no heart, no religion. A corrupt woman. I always knew it and always saw it, though I tried to deceive myself to spare her, he said to himself, and it actually seemed to him that he always had seen it. He recalled incidents of their past life in which he had never seen anything wrong before. Now these incidents proved clearly that she had always been a corrupt woman. I made a mistake in linking my life to hers, but there was nothing wrong in my mistake, and so I cannot be unhappy. It's not I that am to blame, he told himself, but she. But I have nothing to do with her. She does not exist for me. Everything relating to her and her son, towards whom his sentiments were as much changed as towards her, ceased to interest him. The only thing that interested him now was the question of in what way he could best, with most propriety and comfort for himself, and thus with most justice, extricate himself from the mud with which she had spattered him in her fall, and then proceed along his path of active, honorable, and useful existence. I cannot be made unhappy by the fact that a contemptible woman has committed a crime. I have only to find the best way out of the difficult position in which she has placed me, and I shall find it, he said to himself, frowning more and more. "I'm not the first nor the last." And to say nothing of historical instances dating from the fair Helen of Menelaus, recently revived in the memory of all, a whole list of contemporary examples of husbands with unfaithful wives in the highest society rose before Alexey Alexandrovitch's imagination. Daryelov, Poltavsky, Prince Karabanov, Count Pashkudin, Dram, yes, even Dram, such an honest, capable fellow, Semyonov, Chagin, Sigonin. Alexey Alexandrovitch remembered. Admitting that a certain quite irrational ridicule falls to the lot of these men, yet I never saw anything but a misfortune in it, and always felt sympathy for it, Alexey Alexandrovitch said to himself, though indeed this was not the fact, and he had never felt sympathy for misfortunes of that kind, but the more frequently he had heard of instances of unfaithful wives betraying their husbands, the more highly he had thought of himself. It is a misfortune which may befall anyone, and this misfortune has befallen me. The only thing to be done is to make the best of the position. And he began passing in review the methods of proceeding of men who had been in the same position that he was in. Daryelov fought a duel. The duel had particularly fascinated the thoughts of Alexey Alexandrovitch in his youth, just because he was physically a coward, and was himself well aware of the fact. Alexey Alexandrovitch could not without horror contemplate the idea of a pistol aimed at himself, and had never made use of any weapon in his life. This horror had in his youth set him pondering on dueling, and picturing himself in a position in which he would have to expose his life to danger. Having attained success and an established position in the world, he had long ago forgotten this feeling, but the habitual bent of feeling reasserted itself, and dread of his own cowardice proved even now so strong that Alexey Alexandrovitch spent a long while thinking over the question of dueling in all its aspects, and hugging the idea of a duel, though he was fully aware beforehand that he would never, under any circumstances, fight one. "There's no doubt our society is still so barbarous (it's not the same in England) that very many, and among these were those whose opinion Alexey Alexandrovitch particularly valued, look favorably on the duel. But what result is attained by it? Suppose I call him out," Alexey Alexandrovitch went on to himself, and vividly picturing the night he would spend after the challenge and the pistol aimed at him, he shuddered and knew that he never would do it. "Suppose I call him out. Suppose I am taught," he went on musing, "to shoot. I press the trigger," he said to himself, closing his eyes, "and it turns out I have killed him," Alexey Alexandrovitch said to himself, and he shook his head as though to dispel such silly ideas. What sense is there in murdering a man in order to define one's relation to a guilty wife and son? I should still just as much have to decide what I ought to do with her. But what is more probable, and what would doubtless occur, I should be killed or wounded. I, the innocent person, should be the victim, killed or wounded. It's even more senseless. But apart from that, a challenge to fight would be an act hardly honest on my side. Don't I know perfectly well that my friends would never allow me to fight a duel, would never allow the life of a statesman needed by Russia to be exposed to danger? Knowing perfectly well beforehand that the matter would never come to real danger, it would amount to my simply trying to gain a certain sham reputation by such a challenge. That would be dishonest. That would be false. That would be deceiving myself and others. A duel is quite irrational, and no one expects it of me. My aim is simply to safeguard my reputation, which is essential for the uninterrupted pursuit of my public duties." Official duties, which had always been of great consequence in Alexey Alexandrovitch's eyes, seemed of special importance to his mind at this moment. Considering and rejecting the duel, Alexey Alexandrovitch turned to divorce, another solution selected by several of the husbands he remembered. Passing in mental review all the instances he knew of divorces, there were plenty of them in the very highest society with which he was very familiar, Alexey Alexandrovitch could not find a single example in which the object of divorce was that which he had in view. In all these instances the husband had practically ceded or sold his unfaithful wife, and the very party which, being in fault, had not the right to contract a fresh marriage, had formed a counterfeit, pseudo-matrimonial ties with the self-styled husband. In his own case, Alexey Alexandrovitch saw that a legal divorce, that is to say, one in which only the guilty wife would be repudiated, was impossible of attainment. He saw that the complex conditions of the life they led made the coarse proofs of his wife's guilt, required by the law, out of the question. He saw that a certain refinement in that life would not admit of such proofs being brought forward, even if he had them, and that to bring forward such proofs would damage him in the public estimation more than it would her. An attempt at divorce could lead to nothing but a public scandal, which would be a perfect godsend to his enemies for calumny and attacks on his high position in society. His chief object, to define the position with the least amount of disturbance possible, would not be attained by divorce either. Moreover, in the event of divorce, or even of an attempt to obtain a divorce, it was obvious that the wife broke off all relations with the husband and threw in her lot with the lover. And in spite of the complete, as he supposed, contempt and indifference he now felt for his wife, at the bottom of his heart, Alexey Alexandrovitch still had one feeling left in regard to her, a disinclination to see her free to throw in her lot with Vronsky, so that her crime would be to her advantage. The mere notion of this so exasperated Alexey Alexandrovitch that directly it rose to his mind he groaned with inward agony, and got up and changed his place in the carriage, and for a long while after he sat with scowling brows, wrapping his numbed and bony legs in the fleecy rug. Apart from formal divorce, one might still do like Karabanov, Paskudin, and that good fellow Dram, that is, separate from one's wife, he went on thinking, when he had regained his composure. But this step too presented the same drawback of public scandal as a divorce, and what was more, a separation, quite as much as a regular divorce, flung his wife into the arms of Vronsky. "No, it's out of the question. Out of the question," he said again, twisting his rug about him. "I cannot be unhappy, but neither she nor he ought to be happy." The feeling of jealousy, which had tortured him during the period of uncertainty, had passed away at the instant when the tooth had been with agony extracted by his wife's words. But that feeling had been replaced by another, the desire not merely that she should not be triumphant, but that she should get due punishment for her crime. He did not acknowledge this feeling, but at the bottom of his heart he longed for her to suffer for having destroyed his peace of mind, his honor. And going once again over the conditions inseparable from a duel, a divorce, a separation, and once again rejecting them, Alexey Alexandrovitch felt convinced that there was only one solution: to keep her with him, concealing what had happened from the world, and using every measure in his power to break off the intrigue, and still more, though this he did not admit to himself, to punish her. I must inform her of my conclusion, that thinking over the terrible position in which she has placed her family, all other solutions will be worse for both sides than an external status quo, and that such I agree to retain, on the strict condition of obedience on her part to my wishes, that is to say, cessation of all intercourse with her lover." When this decision had been finally adopted, another weighty consideration occurred to Alexey Alexandrovitch in support of it. "By such a course only shall I be acting in accordance with the dictates of religion," he told himself. "In adopting this course I am not casting off a guilty wife, but giving her a chance of amendment, and indeed, difficult as the task will be to me, I shall devote part of my energies to her reformation and salvation." Though Alexey Alexandrovitch was perfectly aware that he could not exert any moral influence over his wife, that such an attempt at reformation could lead to nothing but falsity, though in passing through these difficult moments he had not once thought of seeking guidance in religion, yet now, when his conclusion corresponded, as it seemed to him, with the requirements of religion, this religious sanction to his decision gave him complete satisfaction, and to some extent restored his peace of mind. He was pleased to think that, even in such an important crisis in life, no one would be able to say that he had not acted in accordance with the principles of that religion whose banner he had always held aloft amid the general coolness and indifference. As he pondered over subsequent developments, Alexey Alexandrovitch did not see, indeed, why his relations with his wife should not remain practically the same as before. No doubt she could never again regain his esteem, but there was not, and there could not be, any sort of reason that his existence should be troubled, and that he should suffer because she was a bad and faithless wife. Yes, time will pass, time, which arranges all things, and the old relations will be re-established, Alexey Alexandrovitch told himself. So far re-established, that is, that I shall not be sensible of a break in the continuity of my life. She is bound to be unhappy, but I am not to blame, and so I cannot be unhappy. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Anna Karenina, Book 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philip Griffiths. Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Constance Garnett. Book 3, Chapter 14. As he neared Petersburg, Alexey Alexandrovitch not only adhered entirely to his decision, but was even composing in his head the letter he would write to his wife. Going into the porter's room, Alexey Alexandrovitch glanced at the letters and papers brought from his office and directed that they should be brought to him in his study. "The horses can be taken out, and I will see no one," he said in answer to the porter, with a certain pleasure indicative of his agreeable frame of mind, emphasizing the words "see no one." In his study Alexey Alexandrovitch walked up and down twice and stopped at an immense writing table, on which 6 candles had already been lighted by the valet who had preceded him. He cracked his knuckles and sat down, sorting out his writing appurtenances. Putting his elbows on the table, he bent his head on one side, thought a minute, and began to write without pausing for a second. He wrote without using any form of address to her, and wrote in French, making use of the plural vous, which has not the same note of coldness as the corresponding Russian form. "At our last conversation I notified you of my intention to communicate to you my decision in regard to the subject of that conversation. Having carefully considered everything, I am writing now with the object of fulfilling that promise. My decision is as follows. Whatever your conduct may have been, I do not consider myself justified in breaking the ties in which we are bound by a higher power. The family cannot be broken up by a whim, a caprice, or even by the sin of one of the partners in the marriage, and our life must go on as it has done in the past. This is essential for me, for you, and for our son. I am fully persuaded that you have repented and do repent of what has called forth the present letter, and that you will cooperate with me in eradicating the cause of our estrangement and forgetting the past. In the contrary event you can conjecture what awaits you and your son. All this I hope to discuss more in detail in a personal interview. As the season is drawing to a close, I would beg you to return to Petersburg as quickly as possible, not later than Tuesday. All necessary preparations shall be made for your arrival here. I beg you to note that I attach particular significance to compliance with this request. A. Karenin. P.S. I enclose the money which may be needed for your expenses." He read the letter through and felt pleased with it, and especially that he had remembered to enclose money. There was not a harsh word, not a reproach in it, nor was there undue indulgence. Most of all, it was a golden bridge for return. Folding the letter and smoothing it with a massive ivory knife, and putting it in an envelope with the money, he rang the bell with the gratification it always afforded him to use the well-arranged appointments of his writing-table. "Give this to the courier, to be delivered to Anna Arkadyevna tomorrow at the summer villa," he said, getting up. "Certainly, your excellency. Tea to be served in the study?" Alexey Alexandrovitch ordered tea to be brought to the study, and played with the massive paper knife. He moved to his easy-chair, near which there had been placed ready for him a lamp and the French work on Egyptian hieroglyphics that he had begun. Over the easy-chair there hung in a gold frame an oval portrait of Anna, a fine painting by a celebrated artist. Alexey Alexandrovitch glanced at it. The unfathomable eyes gazed ironically and insolently at him. Insufferably insolent and challenging was the effect in Alexey Alexandrovitch's eyes of the black lace about the head, admirably touched in by the painter, the black hair, and handsome white hand with one finger lifted, covered with rings. After looking at the portrait for a minute, Alexey Alexandrovitch shuddered so that his lips quivered, and he uttered the sound brrr, and turned away. He made haste to sit down in his easy-chair and opened the book. He tried to read, but he could not revive the very vivid interest he had felt before in Egyptian hieroglyphics. He looked at the book and thought of something else. He thought not of his wife, but of a complication that had arisen in his official life, which at the time constituted the chief interest of it. He felt that he had penetrated more deeply than ever before into this intricate affair, and that he had originated a leading idea, he could say it without self-flattery, calculated to clear up the whole business, to strengthen him in his official career, to discomfit his enemies, and thereby to be of the greatest benefit to the government. Directly the servant had set the tea and left the room, Alexey Alexandrovitch got up and went to the writing-table. Moving into the middle of the table a portfolio of papers, with a scarcely perceptible smile of self-satisfaction, he took a pencil from a rack and plunged into the perusal of a complex report relating to the present complication. The complication was of this nature. Alexey Alexandrovitch's characteristic quality as a politician, that special individual qualification that every rising functionary possesses, the qualification that with his unflagging ambition, his reserve, his honesty, and with his self-confidence had made his career, was his contempt for red tape, his cutting down of correspondence, his direct contact wherever possible with the living fact, and his economy. It happened that the famous commission of the 2nd of June had set on foot an inquiry into the irrigation of lands in the Zararsky province, which fell under Alexey Alexandrovitch's department, and was a glaring example of fruitless expenditure and paper reforms. Alexey Alexandrovitch was aware of the truth of this. The irrigation of these lands in the Zararsky province had been initiated by the predecessor of Alexey Alexandrovitch's predecessor, and vast sums of money had actually been spent and were still being spent on this business, and utterly unproductively, and the whole business could obviously lead to nothing whatever. Alexey Alexandrovitch had perceived this at once on entering office, and would have liked to lay hands on the Board of Irrigation. But at first, when he did not yet feel secure in his position, he knew it would affect too many interests and would be injudicious. Later on he had been engrossed in other questions, and had simply forgotten the Board of Irrigation. It went of itself, like all such boards, by the mere force of inertia. Many people gained their livelihood by the Board of Irrigation, especially one highly conscientious and musical family. All the daughters played on stringed instruments, and Alexey Alexandrovitch knew the family, and had stood godfather to one of the elder daughters. The raising of this question by a hostile department was in Alexey Alexandrovitch's opinion a dishonorable proceeding, seeing that in every department there were things similar and worse which no one inquired into for well-known reasons of official etiquette. However, now that the glove had been thrown down to him, he had boldly picked it up and demanded the appointment of a special commission to investigate and verify the working of the Board of Irrigation of the lands in the Zaraisky province. But in compensation he gave no quarter to the enemy either. He demanded the appointment of another special commission to inquire into the question of the Native Tribes Organization Committee. The question of the native tribes had been brought up incidentally in the commission of the 2nd of June, and had been pressed forward actively by Alexey Alexandrovitch as one admitting of no delay on account of the deplorable condition of the native tribes. In the commission this question had been a ground of contention between several departments. The department hostile to Alexey Alexandrovitch proved that the condition of the native tribes was exceedingly flourishing, that the proposed reconstruction might be the ruin of their prosperity, and that if they were anything wrong it arose mainly from the failure on the part of Alexey Alexandrovitch's department to carry out the measures prescribed by law. Now, Alexey Alexandrovitch intended to demand, first, that a new commission should be formed which should be empowered to investigate the condition of the native tribes on the spot. Secondly, if it should appear that the condition of the native tribes actually was such as it appeared to be from the official documents in the hands of the committee, that another new scientific commission should be appointed to investigate the deplorable condition of the native tribes from the 1. Political, 2. Administrative, 3. Economical, 4. Ethnographical, 5. Material, and 6. Religious points of view. Thirdly, that evidence should be required from the rival department of the measures that had been taken during the last 10 years by that department for averting the disastrous conditions in which the native tribes were now placed. And fourthly and finally, that department explain why it had, as appeared from the evidence before the committee from numbers 17015 and 18038, from December 5th, 1863 and June 7th, 1864, acted in direct contravention of the intent of the Law T, Act 18, and the Note to Act 36. A flash of eagerness suffused the face of Alexey Alexandrovitch as he rapidly wrote out a synopsis of these ideas for his own benefit. Having filled a sheet of paper, he got up, rang, and sent a note to the chief secretary of his department to look up certain necessary facts for him. Getting up and walking about the room, he glanced again at the portrait, frowned, and smiled contemptuously. After reading a little more of the book on Egyptian hieroglyphics and renewing his interest in it, Alexey Alexandrovitch went to bed at 11 o'clock, and recollecting as he lay in bed the incident with his wife, he saw it now in by no means such a gloomy light. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Anna Karenina, Book 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philip Griffiths. Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Constance Garnett. Book 3, Chapter 15. Though Anna had obstinately and with exasperation contradicted Vronsky when he told her their position was impossible, At the bottom of her heart she regarded her own position as false and dishonorable, and she longed with her whole soul to change it. On the way home from the races she had told her husband the truth in a moment of excitement, and in spite of the agony she had suffered in doing so, she was glad of it. After her husband had left her, she told herself that she was glad, that now everything was made clear, and at least there would be no more lying and deception. It seemed to her beyond doubt that her position was now made clear forever. It might be bad, this new position, but it would be clear. There would be no indefiniteness or falsehood about it. The pain she had caused herself and her husband in uttering those words would be rewarded now by everything being made clear, she thought. That evening she saw Vronsky, but she did not tell him of what had passed between her and her husband, though to make the position definite it was necessary to tell him. When she woke up next morning, the first thing that rose to her mind was what she had said to her husband, and those words seemed to her so awful that she could not conceive now how she could have brought herself to utter those strange, coarse words, and could not imagine what would come of it. But the words were spoken, and Alexey Alexandrovitch had gone away without saying anything. "I saw Vronsky and did not tell him. At the very instant he was going away, I would have turned him back and told him, but I changed my mind, because it was strange that I had not told him the first minute. Why was it I wanted to tell him and did not tell him?" And in answer to this question a burning blush of shame spread over her face. She knew what had kept her from it. She knew that she had been ashamed. Her position, which had seemed to her simplified the night before, suddenly struck her now as not only not simple, but as absolutely hopeless. She felt terrified at the disgrace of which she had not ever thought before. Directly she thought of what her husband would do, the most terrible ideas came to her mind. She had a vision of being turned out of the house, of her shame being proclaimed to all the world. She asked herself where she should go when she was turned out of the house, and she could not find an answer. When she thought of Vronsky, it seemed to her that he did not love her, that he was already beginning to be tired of her, that she could not offer herself to him, and she felt bitter against him for it. It seemed to her that the words that she had spoken to her husband, and had continually repeated in her imagination, she had said to everyone, and everyone had heard them. She could not bring herself to look those of her own household in the face. She could not bring herself to call her maid, and still less go downstairs and see her son and his governess. The maid, who had been listening at her door for a long while, came into her room of her own accord. Anna glanced inquiringly into her face and blushed with a scared look. The maid begged her pardon for coming in, saying that she had fancied the bell rang. She brought her clothes and a note. The note was from Betsy. Betsy reminded her that Lisa Merkalova and Baroness Stoltz were coming to play croquet with her that morning with their adorers, Kalosky and old Stremov. "Come, if only as a study in morals, I shall expect you," she finished. Anna read the note and heaved a deep sigh. "Nothing, I need nothing," she said to Annushka, who was rearranging the bottles and brushes on the dressing table. "You can go. I'll dress at once and come down. I need nothing." Annushka went out, but Anna did not begin dressing, and sat in the same position, her head and hands hanging listlessly, and every now and then she shivered all over, seemed as though she would make some gesture, utter some word, and sank back into lifelessness again. She repeated continually, "My God, my God," but neither God nor my had any meaning to her. The idea of seeking help in her difficulty in religion was as remote from her as seeking help from Alexey Alexandrovitch himself, although she had never had doubts of the faith in which she had been brought up. She knew that the support of religion was possible only upon condition of renouncing what made up for her the whole meaning of life. She was not simply miserable, she began to feel alarm at the new spiritual condition, never experienced before, in which she found herself. She felt as though everything were beginning to be double in her soul, just as objects sometimes appear double to overtired eyes. She hardly knew at times what it was she feared and what she hoped for, whether she feared or desired what had happened or what was going to happen, and exactly what she longed for she could not have said. "Ah, what am I doing?" she said to herself, feeling a sudden thrill of pain in both sides of her head. When she came to herself she saw that she was holding her hair in both hands, each side of her temples, and pulling it. She jumped up and began walking about. "The coffee is ready, and Mademoiselle and Seryozha are waiting," said Annushka, coming back again and finding Anna in the same position. "Seryozha? What about Seryozha?" Anna asked with sudden eagerness, recollecting her son's existence for the first time that morning. "He's been naughty, I think," answered Annushka with a smile. "In what way?" "Some peaches were lying on the table in the corner room. I think he slipped in and ate one of them on the sly." The recollection of her son suddenly roused Anna from the helpless condition in which she found herself. She recalled the partly sincere, though greatly exaggerated, role of the mother living for her child, which she had taken up of late years, and she felt with joy that in the plight in which she found herself she had a support, quite apart from her relation to her husband or to Vronsky. This support was her son. In whatever position she might be placed she could not lose her son. Her husband might put her to shame and turn her out. Vronsky might grow cold to her and go on living his own life apart. She thought of him again with bitterness and reproach. She could not leave her son. She had an aim in life, and she must act to secure this relation to her son, so that he might not be taken from her. Quickly indeed, as quickly as possible, she must take action before he was taken from her. She must take her son and go away. Here was the one thing she had to do now. She needed consolation. She must be calm and get out of this insufferable position. The thought of immediate action binding her to her son, of going away somewhere with him, gave her this consolation. She dressed quickly, went downstairs, and with resolute steps walked into the drawing-room, where she found, as usual, waiting for her, the coffee, Seryozha, and his governess. Seryozha, all in white, with his back and head bent, was standing at a table under a looking-glass, and with an expression of intense concentration, which she knew well, and in which he resembled his father, he was doing something to the flowers he carried. The governess had a particularly severe expression. Seryozha screamed shrilly, as he often did, "Ah, mamma!" and stopped, hesitating whether to go to greet his mother and put down the flowers, or to finish making the wreath and go with the flowers. The governess, after saying good morning, began a long and detailed account of Seryozha's naughtiness, but Anna did not hear her. She was considering whether she would take her with her or not. "No, I won't take her," she decided. "I'll go alone with my child." "Yes, it is very wrong," said Anna, and taking her son by the shoulder, she looked at him, not severely, but with a timid glance that bewildered and delighted the boy, and she kissed him. "Leave him to me," she said to the astonished governess, and not letting go of her son, she sat down at the table where coffee was set ready for her. "Mamma, I didn't," he said, trying to make out from her expression what was in store for him in regard to the peaches. "Seryozha," she said, as soon as the governess had left the room, "that was wrong, but you'll never do it again, will you? You love me?" She felt that the tears were coming into her eyes. "Can I help loving him?" she said to herself, looking deeply into his scared and at the same time delighted eyes. "And can he ever join his father in punishing me? Is it possible he will not feel for me?" Tears were already flowing down her face, and to hide them she got up abruptly and almost ran out onto the terrace. After the thunder showers of the last few days, cold, bright weather had set in. The air was cold in the bright sun that filtered through the freshly washed leaves. She shivered, both from the cold and from the inward horror which had clutched her with fresh force in the open air. Run along to Mariette," she said to Seryozha, who had followed her out, and she began walking up and down on the straw matting of the terrace. "Can it be that they won't forgive me, won't understand how it all couldn't be helped?" she said to herself. Standing still and looking at the tops of the aspen trees waving in the wind, with their freshly washed, brightly shining leaves in the cold sunshine, she knew that they would not forgive her, that everyone and everything would be merciless to her now, as was that sky, that green. And again she felt that everything was split in two in her soul. "I mustn't think," she said to herself. "I must get ready. To go where? When? Whom to take with me? Yes, to Moscow, by the evening train. Annushka and Seryozha, and only the most necessary things. But first I must write to them both." She went quickly indoors into her boudoir, sat down at the table, and wrote to her husband. "After what has happened I cannot remain any longer in your house. I am going away and taking my son with me. I don't know the law, and so I don't know with which of the parents the son should remain, but I take him with me because I cannot live without him. Be generous. Leave him to me." Up to this point she wrote rapidly and naturally, but the appeal to his generosity, a quality she did not recognize in him, and the necessity of winding up the letter with something touching pulled her up. "Of my fault and my remorse I cannot speak because...." She stopped again, finding no connection in her ideas. "No," she said to herself, "there's no need of anything," and tearing up the letter she wrote it again, leaving out the allusion to generosity, and sealed it up. Another letter had to be written to Vronsky. "I have told my husband," she wrote, and she sat a long while unable to write more. It was so coarse, so unfeminine. "And what more am I to write to him?" she said to herself. Again a flush of shame spread over her face. She recalled his composure, and a feeling of anger against him impelled her to tear the sheet with the phrase she had written into tiny bits. "No need of anything," she said to herself, and closing her blotting case she went upstairs, told the governess and the servants that she was going that day to Moscow, and at once set to work to pack up her things. Chapter 16.